The Great Hall of the Galactic Union stretched for nearly a kilometer in every direction. And Ambassador Vexthalion had stood in this chamber for over 3,000 years. But they had never felt quite so nervous as they did today. The crystalline beings shifted their weight from one leg to another, their body catching the light of 100 distant stars that shone through the transparent ceiling above. And they watched as delegates from across the known universe took their seats in the massive amphitheater. Today was special, and today was dangerous. And today would change everything. Humanity had arrived. The species from the small blue planet called Earth had finally cracked the secret of faster-than-light travel. And now they stood at the entrance of the Great Hall. A small delegation of soft-bodied bipeds who looked around with wide eyes and barely contained excitement. Vexthalion had read the reports about humans, and the reports had given them nightmares for weeks. Captain Elena Vasquez led the human delegation. A woman of average height with dark hair pulled back in a tight knot and eyes that seemed to miss nothing. And she walked with the confident stride of someone who had faced death many times and had somehow always walked away. Behind her came her crew from the exploration vessel U.S. Defiance, including a large man with a thick beard who carried himself like a warrior, a small woman with glasses who kept taking notes on everything she saw, and a mechanic in a stained jumpsuit who was already eyeing the alien technology with obvious hunger. That mechanic worried Vexthalion most of all. His name was Dave Kowalski, and his file was 300 pages long. The delegates from 100 worlds murmured and whispered as the humans took their seats in the section reserved for new member species. And Vexthalion could hear fragments of conversation in dozens of languages. They come from a death world, hissed a Skarathi delegate, their scales rippling with unease. I heard they eat poison for pleasure, clicked the Montari, their mandibles clacking together nervously. One of them punched a Kethrani warrior and survived, whispered a Quilathi. All four of their arms wrapped around themselves in a gesture of fear. Vexthalion raised one crystalline hand, and the hall fell silent. Welcome, honored delegates, to this historic session of the Galactic Union Assembly, they began, their voice carrying to every corner of the vast chamber through ancient acoustic technology. Today, we formally recognize humanity as a provisional member of our great union. And today, we must also address certain matters of protocol. The standard orientation speech took nearly an hour, covering everything from trade, regulations to territorial boundaries, to the list of forbidden technologies that no species was allowed to develop. And throughout it all, the humans listened politely and asked intelligent questions. Captain Vasquez seemed particularly interested in the sections about mutual defense treaties, and her tactical officer took detailed notes on the military capabilities of various member species. When the standard material was finished, Vexthalion paused and took a deep breath that they did not technically need. There is one final matter, they said. And something in their tone made every delegate in the chamber lean forward. A new addition to Union law that has been created specifically for our newest members. The humans exchanged confused glances. This addition is known as the Vexthalion Addendum, the ambassador continued. And it states the following. When a human utters the phrase, hold my beer, or any cultural equivalent, all sapient beings within a standard light minute are advised to evacuate immediately. Silence filled the hall. Then Captain Vasquez laughed, a warm sound that echoed off the distant walls. And several of her crew members joined in. Is that a joke? She asked. Still smiling, Vexthalion's crystalline face could not show expression. But somehow, every being in the chamber knew they were completely serious. It is not a joke, Captain, they replied. It is a survival guideline based on documented incidents. The laughter died away. Perhaps an example would help. Vexthalion continued. And they activated a holographic display that showed a small space station orbiting a gas giant. This is Helion 4 Research Station. 3 years ago, before humanity's official first contact with the Union, the display showed the interior of the station, where a massive reactor core was glowing an angry red and alarms were flashing everywhere. A quantum fissure had opened in the station's main reactor. Vexthalion explained. Our best engineers said it was impossible to repair, and they began evacuation procedures for the 3,000 beings on board. The hologram shifted to show a human in a mechanic's jumpsuit standing before the damaged reactor, and Captain Vasquez felt her stomach drop as she recognized the face. It was Dave Kowalski. This human had been working on a cargo vessel docked at the station. Vexthalion said. When he heard about the reactor failure, he approached the lead engineer, handed them his beverage, and spoke full words. The hologram showed Dave saying something. Though no audio played, he said, "Hold my beer?" Vexthalion confirmed. Then he entered the reactor chamber with only a roll of adhesive material, a metal tool, and what he later described as a good feeling about this. The next images showed Dave inside the reactor chamber, doing things to the quantum fissure that violated at least 17 laws of physics. He sealed the fissure, Vexthalion said, using methods that our scientists still cannot explain. And the station was saved. Captain Vasquez let out a breath she had not realized she was holding. That sounds like a good thing, she said carefully. It was, Vexthalion agreed. However, a side effect of his repairs was that the gravitational output of the reactor briefly increased by a factor of 10,000. And this caused 3 of the gas giant's moons to change their orbits permanently. The hologram showed the moons spinning away into new trajectories. 2 of them now orbit each other, Vexthalion added. The third left the system entirely and is currently traveling toward the galactic rim. Captain Vasquez slowly turned to look at Dave Kowalski, who was studying the ceiling with sudden intense interest. "Dave," she said quietly. "In my defense," Dave replied, "those moons were in really boring orbits before." Before Vasquez could respond, every light in the great hall turned red, and a piercing alarm began to sound. "Emergency transmission incoming," announced a mechanical voice. "Priority 1 distress signal from the Korath Nebula." The holographic display shifted to show a star map, and at the center of the nebula was a symbol that made every alien delegate in the chamber gasp in horror. "The Devour Swarm," whispered the Skarathi delegate. "Impossible. They were destroyed 10,000 years ago." "Apparently not," said Vexthalion. And for the first time, their voice carried something that sounded like fear. "The signal indicates that our combined fleet in that sector has been destroyed, and the swarm is growing." Chaos erupted in the hall as delegates shouted and screamed, and some simply fled through it all. Captain Elena Vasquez sat very still, watching the display, calculating odds and distances and resources. Then she stood up. "Ambassador," she called out, her voice cutting through the noise. "How long until the swarm reaches populated systems?" Vexthalion looked at her with something approaching hope. 72 standard hours. Vasquez nodded once and turned to her crew. "Get back to the Defiance," she ordered. "We have work to do." As the humans marched out of the hall, Vexthalion heard Dave Kowalski crack his knuckles and mutter something under his breath. The ambassador did not catch all of it, but they were fairly certain they heard the word beer. They immediately began composing their will. The used Defiance was not the largest ship in the human fleet, and it was not the most heavily armed. And it was certainly not the prettiest vessel ever built by human hands. But Captain Elena Vasquez loved it like a member of her own family. She stood on the bridge and watched through the main viewport as stars stretched into long lines of light. The ship hurtling through folded space toward the Korath Nebula at speeds that would have seemed impossible just a decade ago behind her. Her crew worked at their stations with the quiet efficiency that came from years of serving together through danger and disaster. "Captain," "We have a guest arriving on the bridge," announced Lieutenant Commander Sarah Chun from the communications station, before Vasquez could ask who it was. The bridge doors slid open, and a being unlike any that the crew had seen before stepped through. He stood about 5 feet tall, with smooth blue-gray skin and 4 arms that he kept folded across his chest in what appeared to be a permanent gesture of anxiety, and his large black eyes darted around the bridge like a trapped animal looking for escape routes. "I am Torvan of the Qualathi Diplomatic Corps," he announced in a voice that trembled slightly. "The Galactic Union has assigned me to your vessel as an official observer. Welcome aboard," Vasquez said. Extending her hand in greeting, Torvan stared at the hand for a long moment before one of his 4 arms reached out and shook it with obvious reluctance. "Your species' greeting ritual involves grabbing each other," he observed. "I have read that this is not considered a prelude to combat." "Not usually," Vasquez confirmed with a small smile. "Let me introduce you to my senior staff." She gestured to the large bearded man at the tactical station. "This is Sergeant Marcus O'Brien. He leads our Marine detachment, and we call him Brick because that is what his head is made of." O'Brien grinned and waved a hand that looked big enough to crush a small melon. "Over here is Dr. Yuki Tanaka, our chief science officer and xenobiologist," Vasquez continued, pointing to the small woman with glasses who was studying a holographic display of the Devour Swarm. Tanaka looked up briefly and nodded before returning to her work. "And somewhere in the bowels of this ship," Vasquez finished, "is Chief Engineer Dave Kowalski. But I would recommend not visiting him without protective gear." Torvan's eyes went wide. "Dave Kowalski," he repeated. "The one from the Helion 4 incident?" "The very same." The Qualathi made a sound that might have been a whimper. "I wish to formally protest this assignment," he said. "Noted," Vasquez replied cheerfully. "Now let me show you to your quarters. Over the next several hours, Torvan learned many things about humans that his training had not prepared him for. He learned that they played loud music during faster-than-light travel because they claimed it made the trip go faster, even though this was physically impossible. He learned that they consumed a substance called coffee that contained enough stimulants to kill a Qualathi and called it the only way to start the morning. He learned that they expressed affection for each other through ritualized insults, and that calling someone a magnificent idiot was apparently a term of deep respect. He learned that when the ship's artificial gravity failed for 6 hours due to what Dave called a minor technical hiccup, the crew invented a new sport that involved pushing cargo crates at each other while floating through the corridors. He learned that humans were absolutely insane, and he learned that he was stuck with them when the Defiance finally dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the Korath Nebula. Torvan had already written 3 separate requests for reassignment, all of which had been denied. What he saw through the viewport made him forget about writing a 4th. The nebula was beautiful in the way that natural disasters were beautiful. A swirling mass of purple and gold gases lit from within by the light of dying stars. And scattered throughout this cosmic wonder were the remains of the greatest fleet the Galactic Union had ever assembled. Broken ships drifted through the void, their hulls torn open like paper, their crews long dead. And among the wreckage moved things that made Torvan's blood run cold. The Devourers were everywhere. They looked like insects the size of buildings, with chitinous shells that gleamed with an oily darkness, and too many legs and too many eyes and mouths that never stopped moving. And they swarmed over the dead ships in their billions, consuming metal and flesh and energy with equal hunger. "Mother of God," whispered O'Brien from the tactical station. "There are so many," Tanaka breathed, her scientific detachment cracking for the first time since Torvan had met her captain. "We are receiving a transmission," Chun announced. It is from the Union flagship. Or what is left of it. The main screen flickered to life, showing the face of Admiral Kethrus, a Mentari whose usually pristine carapace was cracked and stained with what looked like blood. Human vessel, he clicked, his mandibles moving weakly. You should not have come here. And you cannot win this fight. And you should flee while you still can. With respect, Admiral. Fleeing is not really our style, Vasquez replied. You do not understand, Kethrus said, and desperation filled his voice. We threw everything we had at them, and our weapons did nothing. And our shields might as well have been made of paper. And every ship we lost just made them stronger, because they consume our technology and adapt. Through the damaged hull behind him, Torvan could see devourers crawling across the outer surface of the flagship, their mouths leaving trails of dissolved metal. At the center of the swarm is the Queen, the Admiral continued, a creature the size of a moon that controls all the others through some kind of psychic link. And as long as she lives, the swarm cannot be stopped. Then we kill the Queen. Vasquez said simply. Kethrus made a sound that might have been a laugh or might have been a sob. You cannot even reach her, he said. The swarm protects her with billions of bodies. And anything that gets close is torn apart in seconds. The transmission cut off as something massive struck the flagship. And through the viewport, the crew of the Defiance watched the proud vessel break apart. Silence filled the bridge. Then a door opened, and Dave Kowalski walked in, wiping grease from his hands with a rag that was dirtier than his hands had been. He looked at the screen showing the impossible swarm, looked at the faces of his crewmates, looked at the billions of monsters that stood between them and their target. Then he finished a can of something that smelled like engine coolant mixed with fruit juice, walked over to Torvan and held it out. Hold my beer, he said. Torvan took the can automatically, then realized what he had done and felt all four of his hearts stop beating for a moment. What are you planning? Vasquez asked, though she sounded like she was not sure she wanted to know the answer. Dave cracked his knuckles and smiled. The smile of a man who had stared into the void and decided the void needed a good kicking, Captain, he said. I am going to turn our FTL drive into a bomb, fly it into that Queen's ugly face, and blow her up from the inside. That is impossible. Torvan heard himself say, probably. Dave agreed. You will die. Torvan continued, possibly. Dave shrugged. This is insane. Torvan finished. Dave's smile grew wider. Definitely. And somewhere in the back of the ship, someone turned on the music system, and the opening notes of Highway to Hell filled the bridge. Torvan looked at the empty can in his hands, looked at the swarm of monsters on the screen, looked at the insane humans who were already beginning to prepare for the most stupid mission in galactic history. Then he did something he had never done before in his entire careful life. He laughed. The plan was simple, which meant it was absolutely insane. Captain Vasquez gathered her senior staff in the briefing room while the Devour Swarm continued to consume the remains of the Union fleet just a few thousand kilometers away. And she laid out what Dave had started calling Operation Reckless Stupidity. Phase 1, she explained, pointing at a holographic map of the swarm. We fly directly into the swarm while broadcasting every signal we can think of to confuse their hive mind. And while they are distracted, Sergeant O'Brien leads a boarding team to one of their cluster ships to plant relay beacons. What do the beacons do? Torvan asked from his seat in the corner, where he had been sitting very quietly and trying not to think about how he was going to die. They will scramble the swarm's ability to predict our movements, Dr. Tanaka answered. Think of it like creating static in their collective brain. Phase 2, Vasquez continued. Once the beacons are active, we punch through the swarm's defensive perimeter and fly directly into the Queen herself. And I mean literally into her. through her outer membrane and into her internal structure. That is disgusting, Torvan observed. That is the fun part, O'Brien grinned. Phase 3, Vasquez finished. Dave has modified our FTL drive into what he calls a quantum burrito, which I am told will create a contained singularity that will tear the Queen apart from the inside. And we set the timer and get out before it explodes. What if we cannot get out in time? Torvan asked. Everyone in the room looked at him with expressions that suggested this was not a helpful question. Then we die as heroes, Dave said cheerfully, which is better than dying as cowards, so really it is a win either way. Torvan decided he was never going to understand humans. The Defiance launched into the swarm 30 minutes later, its engines burning hot and its weapons charging, and its external speakers blasting music at volumes that would have been illegal on most civilized worlds. The effect on the Devourers was immediate and dramatic. The creatures had a hive mind that operated through some kind of psychic link, a shared consciousness that allowed billions of individuals to act as one. And this link was apparently very sensitive to outside interference when the Defiance began broadcasting a mix of heavy metal music, recorded human political debates, sports commentary, and what Dave insisted on calling the good stuff, which turned out to be songs about trucks and heartbreak and drinking beer on beaches. The swarm went absolutely crazy. Devourers crashed into each other, flew in circles, attacked their own allies, and generally behaved like they had all developed sudden and severe headaches. It is working, Tanaka shouted over the noise of alarms and weapons fire. Their coordination is breaking down. Brick, you are up. Vasquez commanded. Sergeant O'Brien led his team of 12 Marines to the hangar bay, where a heavily armored shuttle waited to carry them to their target. A Devourer cluster ship that was essentially a floating fortress made of living creatures all fused together into one horrible structure. Listen up, O'Brien bellowed to his team as they loaded into the shuttle. Our mission is simple. We land on that ugly thing, fight our way to the center, plant the beacons, and fight our way back out. What if we encounter heavy resistance? Asked Corporal Martinez. Then we encounter it heavily back, O'Brien replied. Any other stupid questions? There were no other stupid questions. The shuttle launched into the swarm, weaving between devourer organisms that were too confused by the Defiance's broadcast to coordinate an attack. And within minutes, they had landed on the surface of the cluster. The surface was not metal or stone or anything that made sense, but rather a landscape of flesh and chitin and things that pulsed and oozed and moved in ways that would give the Marines nightmares for years to come. Spread out and move fast, O'Brien ordered, and his team advanced into the nightmare back on the Defiance. Dr. Tanaka made a discovery that changed everything. Captain, I have been analyzing the swarm's communication patterns, she reported, her fingers flying across her console. The Queen does not just control the swarm psychically. She also releases a pheromone signal that coordinates their movements at close range. Can we disrupt it? Vasquez asked. If I can get a genetic sample from the Queen herself, I can synthesize a counteragent, Tanaka explained. Something that would make her pheromone signal tell the swarm to attack itself instead of us. That would be very helpful. Vasquez agreed. Add it to the mission objectives, down in the engine room. Dave Kowalski was performing engineering miracles that would have made his professors weep with confusion and his safety inspectors weep with terror. The failed drive had been almost completely disassembled, its components scattered across the floor in a pattern that only Dave seemed to understand. And at the center of it all sat a glowing ball of contained energy that pulsed like a heartbeat. Orvin had followed Dave to the engine room, partly because he was supposed to observe and report, and partly because he had nowhere else to go. And he watched with growing horror as Dave worked. That is not how quantum containment fields work. Torvan observed as Dave welded two components together that should not have been able to exist in the same space. "You are probably right," Dave agreed without looking up. "If you make a mistake, you will create a black hole that will consume this entire nebula," Torvan continued. "That is why I'm not going to make a mistake," Dave replied. "How can you be sure?" Dave finally looked up, and his eyes held something that Torvan had not expected to see. A calm certainty that went beyond confidence into something almost like faith. "Because my friends are counting on me," he said simply. "And I do not let my friends down." Then he went back to work. And Torvan found himself handing Dave tools before being asked, anticipating what he needed. Working alongside him like they had been partners for years. "You are learning," Dave said with a grin. Torvan was horrified to realize that he was right on the cluster ship. Things were going badly. O'Brien and his Marines had fought their way halfway to the center when the swarm finally started to adapt to the Defiance's broadcasts. And suddenly, the creatures were coordinating again, pouring toward the human intruders from every direction. "Fall back to position 7. O'Brien roared, firing his rifle until it overheated, and then using it as a club. Private Chen went down with a devourer attached to his leg, and Martinez dragged him to safety while O'Brien held off 3 attackers at once. They planted the first beacon in a central nerve cluster, and the effect was immediate. The creatures around them stumbling and crashing into walls as the beacon scrambled their local communications. 2 more to go. O'Brien shouted, "Move!" They lost 2 more Marines before they reached the second beacon point, and O'Brien took a wound to his shoulder that he ignored through sheer stubbornness at the 3rd beacon point. They found themselves surrounded. O'Brien was out of ammunition. His rifle broken, his knife lost somewhere in the chest of a Devourer Alpha, and he faced the horde with nothing but his helmet and his fists. He thought about his daughter back on Earth, about the promise he had made to come home, about all the things he still wanted to do with his life. Then he thought about his crew, about the mission, about what would happen if he failed. He put on his helmet, raised his fists, and smiled. "Come on then," he growled at the swarm. "Let me show you how humans say goodbye." What followed was 3 minutes of the most brutal, desperate, creative violence that any being had ever witnessed. And when it was over, O'Brien stood alone in a pile of broken Devourer bodies, breathing hard, bleeding from a dozen wounds, and laughing like a madman. "Beacon 3 is active," he reported into his communicator. "All Marines return to the shuttle. We are going home on the bridge of the Defiance." Vasquez watched the beacons come online and felt hope bloom in her chest. "All stations report ready." Chun announced, "Beacon network is active." Tanaka confirmed, "Quantum Burrito is hot and ready." Dave's voice crackled over the intercom. Vasquez took a deep breath and looked at the mass of the Queen on her screen. A moon-sized nightmare that was the heart of the swarm. "All hands," she said. "Prepare for the stupidest thing we have ever done." And the crew of the Defiance cheered. The Defiance punched through the outer membrane of the Devourer Queen like a bullet through skin, and the ship's hull screamed in protest as organic matter tore and ripped around them. Inside the Queen was a nightmare made real. The interior was not hollow like a normal creature, but filled with tunnels and chambers and organic machinery that pulsed and throbbed with a life of its own. And everything was coated in a slick substance that glowed faintly green in the emergency lighting. Impact in 30 seconds. Lieutenant Chun shouted from her station, "All hands brace." Vasquez commanded. The ship hit something solid and came to a violent stop, throwing everyone forward against their restraints. And for a long moment, the only sound was the groaning of the hull and the dripping of something wet onto metal. Status report. Vasquez demanded as soon as she could breathe again. "Hull integrity at 62%, Tanaka reported, her voice shaking slightly. "Multiple breaches on decks 3 and 4. Life support functioning at minimal capacity. Weapon systems offline. O'Brien added, his wounded shoulder making his voice tight with pain. But I can still shoot a rifle. So that is something. The quantum burrito is stable. Dave's voice came over the intercom, which honestly surprised me a little. Vasquez allowed herself 1 second to be terrified, then pushed the fear aside and focused on the mission. We split into 2 teams, she announced. Team 1 is me, Dr. Tanaka, Sergeant O'Brien, and 4 Marines. And we push toward the Queen's neural core to plant the bomb and get that genetic sample. Team 2? Tovan asked from his position near the back of the bridge, where he had been clutching a support beam with all 4 arms. Team 2 is everyone else, Vasquez replied. Stay here, keep the ship functioning, and be ready to fly out of here the moment we get back. Captain, Dave's voice came again. Someone needs to stay with the burrito to make sure it does not destabilize. And that someone should probably be me. Agreed. Vasquez nodded. Torvan, you stay with Dave and help him however you can. The Kalathi opened his mouth to protest, then closed it again. Then nodded slowly. I will do my best, he said quietly. Team 1 gathered their weapons and supplies and headed for the nearest airlock. Stepping out into the organic hellscape that was the Queen's interior, the tunnel stretched in every direction. Some wide enough for a shuttle to fly through, and others barely big enough for a human to crawl. And all of them were alive in ways that made Tanaka's scientific mind race with questions she did not want answers to. Which way? O'Brien asked, his rifle sweeping the darkness ahead. Tanaka consulted her scanner, which was struggling to make sense of readings that did not match any known biology. The neural core should be approximately 3 kilometers in that direction, she said, pointing down a tunnel that sloped sharply downward. But I am detecting significant movement between us and the target. Significant meaning what exactly? Vasquez asked, as if in answer, a sound echoed through the tunnel. A chittering, clicking noise that seemed to come from everywhere at once. And then shapes began to emerge from the walls. The Devourer Queen's internal defenses were not like the creatures outside. Not individual organisms, but rather extensions of the Queen herself. Tendrils and claws and mouths that grew from the walls and floor and ceiling without warning, contact. O'Brien roared, and the battle began. They fought for every meter, pushing forward through waves of organic horror that seemed endless. And the tunnel walls ran with fluids that burned when they touched exposed skin. Private Morrison fell first, dragged into a wall that opened up and swallowed him whole before anyone could react. Corporal Davis went next. Overwhelmed by tendrils that erupted from the floor beneath her feet, O'Brien fought like a demon, ignoring his wounds, ignoring his exhaustion, ignoring everything except the need to keep moving forward. Tanaka stayed close to Vasquez, her scanner in one hand and a pistol in the other, firing at anything that came too close while tracking their progress toward the neural core. They lost another Marine at the halfway point, then another at the 3/4 mark, and by the time they finally reached the chamber that housed the neural core, only 4 of them remained. The neural core was a cathedral of flesh, a massive cavern filled with pulsing tissue that glowed with bioluminescent light. And at the center sat a structure that looked almost like a brain. If a brain were the size of a building and covered in eyes that all turned to look at them as they entered. That is our target, Tanaka whispered. It knows we are here. O'Brien observed grimly. Then let us not keep it waiting, Vasquez replied. And she stepped forward. Getting the genetic sample was worse than Tanaka had imagined. The neural core fought back, sending waves of psychic pressure that made her vision blur and her thoughts scatter, and physical defenses that nearly tore her arm off when she got close enough to extract the tissue she needed. But she got it. A fist-sized chunk of neural matter that would let her create the counteragent they needed. Sample secured. She shouted over the roar of combat, "Plant the bomb!" Vasquez commanded. O'Brien pulled the device from his pack. A simple timer connected to a transmitter that would activate the quantum burrito remotely, and he slammed it into the neural core's surface. The Queen screamed. It was not a sound that could be heard with ears, but rather a psychic shriek that tore through every mind in range. And for a moment, Vasquez thought her skull was going to split open. Then it was over, and the Queen's defenses redoubled their assault. Fall back. Vasquez ordered, "Everyone out now." They ran back on the ship. Dave and Torvin were having problems of their own. The Queen had figured out that something was wrong with the strange metal thing inside her, and she was trying to digest the defiance with all the resources she had available. Acid dripped from the ceiling, burning through deck plates and creating holes that had to be constantly sealed. And organic tendrils probed at the hull looking for weak points. Dave had jury-rigged the ship's shields into what he called an acid umbrella, a protective field that deflected most of the corrosive substances. But it was draining power at an alarming rate. "We are losing containment on deck 2. Torvan reported from his position at the engineering console. "Seal it off and reroute power to the shields." Dave shouted back. Torvan's 4 hands flew across the controls, doing things he had never been trained to do, making decisions that went against every protocol he had ever learned, and somehow, miraculously, it worked. "I think I am becoming a human," Torvan muttered to himself. Then his scanner beeped with a reading that made his blood freeze. "Dave!" He called out, "The quantum burrito is destabilizing." Dave ran to the containment unit and looked at the readings, and his face went pale. The psychic shockwave from the Queen must have disrupted the quantum field. He said quietly, "We have maybe 20 minutes before it detonates. Not the 60 we planned. The away team will never make it back in time." Torvan realized Dave stood very still for a long moment, and when he spoke again, his voice was calm, in a way that frightened Torvan more than anything else that had happened. "Then I will have to fly the ship deeper into the Queen and detonate it manually," he said. "You will die." Torvan whispered, "Probably." Dave agreed. He opened a communication channel to Captain Vasquez. "Captain," he said, "change of plans. You need to get to the extraction point on the Queen's outer membrane. There is a weak spot about 500 meters from your current position, and I will have a rescue shuttle meet you there." "Dave, what is happening?" Vasquez demanded. "No time to explain," Dave replied. "Just trust me and go. I have got this." The channel closed. Torvan stared at Dave, at this strange human who was preparing to sacrifice himself without hesitation, without complaint, without even seeming particularly upset about it. "I am staying with you," Torvan heard himself say. Dave looked at him with surprise. "You will die," he pointed out. "Probably," Torvan replied, and he was amazed to find that his voice did not shake. "But you will require assistance, and I find that I do not wish to leave." Dave stared at him for a long moment, and then he smiled, a genuine smile that lit up his whole face. "All right then, little buddy," he said, reaching for the can of whatever terrible beverage he had been drinking. "Hold my beer." Torvan took the can, and together they prepared to fly into the heart of darkness. The Defiance roared through the Queen's internal tunnels like a bullet made of determination and bad decisions, its hull scraping against organic walls that tried desperately to close around it. Dave Kowalski sat at the pilot station, his hands steady on the controls despite everything, guiding the ship through passages that were never meant for anything but the Queen's own twisted biology beside him. Torvan worked the sensor console with all 4 hands, calling out warnings and course corrections in a voice that had stopped shaking. Somewhere around the 3rd near-death experience, "Sharp turn ahead," Torvan shouted, 40 degrees starboard. Dave yanked the controls, and the ship screamed in protest, but made the turn, barely avoiding a wall of teeth that snapped shut behind them. "How much time?" Dave asked. 11 minutes until detonation, Torvan replied. And how far to the central neural cluster? Approximately 800 meters, Dave grinned. And Torvan had learned enough about humans to know the grin meant Dave had thought of something either brilliant or insane. Probably both. Then we are going to make it, Dave said. The odds of survival are approximately 14%, Torvan reminded him. I have had worse odds at poker, Dave replied, outside the Queen. Captain Vasquez and what remained of her team burst through the creature's outer membrane and tumbled into the cold vacuum of space. Their emergency suits activating just in time to keep them alive. A Union rescue shuttle was waiting for them, somehow having survived the chaos of the battle. And its pilot pulled them aboard with the efficiency of someone who had done this too many times before. Where is the defiance? Vasquez demanded as soon as she was inside. Still in there, the pilot replied, pointing at the massive bulk of the Queen on the view screen. Ma'am, whatever your people are doing, it is working. The swarm is falling apart. Vasquez looked at the screen and saw that he was right. Dr. Tanaka had transmitted her counteragent formula to the surviving Union ships the moment they escaped. And now those ships were broadcasting the modified pheromone signal across every frequency they could reach. The effect was devastating. Devour organisms turned on each other, their hive mind fragmenting into chaos, their perfect coordination dissolving into mindless violence. And across the nebula, the swarm that had seemed unstoppable began to tear itself apart. But none of that mattered to Vasquez, because Dave was still in there. Dave, she said into her communicator. Dave, respond. What is your status? For a long moment there was only static, and then Dave's voice crackled through. Strained but still somehow cheerful. Hey, Captain, he said. We are almost at the target. Should be there in about 2 minutes. We? Vasquez asked. Torvan stayed with me, Dave replied. And there was something in his voice that sounded like pride. Turns out the little guy has guts after all. Get out of there, Vasquez ordered. That is a command, Dave. Find a way out. Working on it, Captain, Dave said. But first, we have a Queen to kill. Inside the Queen, the Defiance finally reached the central neural cluster, a cavern of pulsing tissue where the bomb that O'Brien had planted was glowing with the transmitted signal from the ship. Dave brought the ship to a stop right next to it and looked at the quantum burritos. Timer 4 minutes. Okay, he said, turning to Torvan. Here is the plan. There is a plan? Torvan asked, surprised. There is always a plan, Dave replied. It is usually a terrible plan, but it is still a plan. He pulled up a schematic on the navigation console, showing the Queen's internal structure and the path they had taken to get here. The Queen's outer membrane is weakened right here, he said, pointing to a spot about 300 meters away. If we overload the emergency thrusters at the exact moment the bomb detonates, the shock wave should blow us through that weak point and out into space. Should? Torvan repeated. The math is a little fuzzy. Dave admitted. A little fuzzy? Okay, very fuzzy, but I believe in us. Torvan looked at Dave. At this impossible human who refused to give up even when the universe itself seemed determined to kill him. And he made a decision. I believe in us too, he said. Dave smiled and held out his hand, and Torvan took it. And for a moment, they were not a human and a Quilathi, but simply two friends facing the end together. On my mark, Dave said, his hand hovering over the thruster controls. The timer counted down 3 minutes. 2 minutes, 1 minute, 30 seconds. Mark! Dave shouted. He slammed the thruster controls forward at the exact moment the quantum burrito reached zero. And the universe turned inside out. The bomb detonated with a force that defied physics, creating a contained singularity that tore through the Queen's neural cluster like a tornado through paper. And the psychic scream that erupted from the dying creature was felt by every sentient Being within 100 light years, the Defiance rode the shockwave like a surfboard on a tsunami, its hull buckling and tearing, its systems failing one by one, but somehow still moving forward, still pushing toward that weak point in the Queen's membrane. They hit the membrane at speeds that should have destroyed them instantly. But the shockwave had weakened the organic material enough that they punched through instead of being splattered against it. And suddenly, they were tumbling through open space, surrounded by the expanding cloud of debris that had once been the Devourer Queen. The ship was dying. Its engines gone, its life support failing, its hull venting atmosphere from a dozen wounds. But Dave and Torvan were alive. They were alive, emergency beacon activated. Torvan reported weakly. Rescue ship should find us within minutes. Dave laughed. A sound that started small and grew until it filled the ruined bridge, and Torvan found himself laughing too. A sound he had never made before in his entire careful life. They had done it. 6 months later. The Galactic Union held the largest celebration in its 10,000-year history. The crew of the used Defiance stood on a stage in the Great Hall of the Axiom Prime, receiving medals and honors from species that had never before acknowledged humans as anything but dangerous curiosities. Captain Elena Vasquez received the Star of Unity. The highest honor the Union could bestow. Sergeant Marcus O'Brien received the Warrior's Cross, given to those who showed exceptional valor in combat. Dr. Yuki Tanaka received the Scientific Excellence Medal for her work on the counteragent that had turned the swarm against itself. And Dave Kowalski received a statue. He found this extremely embarrassing. I do not need a statue, he protested to anyone who would listen. I was just doing my job. Your job involved turning an FTL drive into a bomb and riding a shockwave out of a dying space monster, Vasquez pointed out. That deserves a statue, maybe a small one. Dave conceded Torvan received something even more unexpected, a promotion. The Qualathi had been appointed as the first ambassador of his species to Earth, a position he had requested specifically because he said he wanted to understand humans better. You are strange creatures, he told Vasquez at the reception after the ceremony. Violent and chaotic and completely insane. Thank you, Vasquez replied. But you are also brave and loyal and willing to sacrifice everything for each other. Torvan continued. And I think the galaxy needs more of that. Across the room, Ambassador Vexthalion was updating the official Galactic Union records. The Vexthalion addendum remained in effect, warning all species to flee when a human uttered those 4 fateful words. But a new section had been added, subsection 2. Vexthalion read aloud to a gathering of curious delegates. If a human says, "Hold my beer," and you cannot flee, stay close, because against all probability you may survive, and you will have a story worth telling for the rest of your days. The delegates murmured in appreciation as the celebration wound down. Vasquez found Dave standing alone on a balcony overlooking the stars, nursing a drink and staring out at the nebula where they had nearly died. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. Joining him at the railing, Dave shrugged, a gesture that somehow conveyed 1,000 things he did not have words for. "Just wondering what we will do next," he said. Vasquez laughed and shook her head, marveling at this man who had stared death in the face and was already looking for the next adventure, whatever it is. She said, "I am sure it will be completely insane." "Probably," Dave agreed, "and incredibly dangerous. Almost certainly, and against all odds. We will probably survive." Dave turned to look at her, and his eyes held that same calm certainty she had seen in the engine room of the Defiance. That unshakable faith in his friends and his crew and himself. "Definitely," he said, and somewhere in the distance, a new alarm began to sound, signaling that the universe had found another impossible problem that needed solving. Vasquez sighed, finished her drink, and turned toward the door. "Come on," she said. Let us go see what fresh hell is waiting for us. Dave grinned, grabbed his beer, and followed her into whatever came next, because that was what humans did. They faced the impossible, said, "Hold my beer," and somehow made it through to the other side, and the galaxy was learning to be very grateful for that.